45 people boarded a plane. Only 16 came home. Between those two numbers, 72 days of silence, starvation, and decisions no human being should ever have to make. October 13, 1972, Mendoza, Argentina. On this Friday afternoon, a Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild turboprop lifted off from Mendoza's runway with 45 people aboard, most of them young men in their 20s, members of the Old Christians Rugby Club, heading to Santiago for a friendly match. They carried rugby balls, wine bottles, and the easy laughter of boys on vacation. Someone tossed a ball down the aisle before takeoff. Someone else passed around a flask. The mood was loose, restless, young. The kind of afternoon you forget the moment you land. The flight was supposed to take 90 minutes. What no one on that plane realized is that their fate would not be decided by the crash. It would be decided by a single sentence spoken by the co-pilot before he died. 6 words, "We already passed Curacao," that sent every rescue team searching in the wrong direction, left 45 people invisible on a white glacier at 12,000 feet, and forced a group of rugby players to become something no one had ever been before. Those 6 words. That is where this story begins. This is not the story of a plane crash and cannibalism. This is the story of how ordinary friendship, desperate ingenuity, and a 22-year-old's refusal to let his father grieve alone became the engine of the greatest self-rescue in history. By minute 5, you'll understand the chain of errors that put them on that mountain. By minute 9, you'll see the decision that divided them between the living and the dead. And by the end, you'll know why the very act the world condemned is the reason more than 120 people are alive today. But first, you need to understand the world these boys came from, and why every instinct it gave them was wrong. In 1972, Montevideo was a city of Catholic families, rugby clubs, and tight-knit friendships that began in childhood and lasted for life. The Old Christians Club, named for the Stella Maris Christian Brothers School where these boys had grown up together, was not just a rugby team. It was a brotherhood. These boys had been baptized together, studied together, played together since they were 6 years old. Their mothers knew each other. Their fathers did business together. Their sisters dated each other's teammates. In Montevideo's close-knit upper-middle class, everyone was someone's cousin, someone's neighbor, someone's oldest friend. They were not adventurers. They were not soldiers. They were dental students, law students, a medical student who had not yet finished his degree. They had never climbed a mountain. They had never spent a night outdoors in freezing temperatures. The most dangerous thing most of them had ever done was play a rugby match against a bigger team in the rain. And in 1971, they had made this exact trip, chartered a military plane, flown across the Andes, played their match in Santiago, flown home safely, and nothing had gone wrong. That memory, that ease, that confidence was the most dangerous thing they carried onto the plane. Because the success of that first trip is exactly what made them push for the second one, past every warning sign that should have stopped them. Commercial flights across the Andes were expensive. Too expensive for a rugby club of university students. So they did what they had done the year before, chartered a Fairchild FH-227D from the Uruguayan Air Force. Military planes were cheaper. You could fill the extra seats with friends, family, supporters, anyone who wanted to come along and split the cost. That's how a 3-hour rugby flight ended up carrying not just players but mothers, wives, friends, a middle-aged couple heading to a wedding, and the team's most loyal supporters. 40 passengers and 5 crew. Not a military operation. A family outing with wings. The plane itself was solid, a twin-engine turboprop built for regional routes. Reliable, proven. But the Andes are not a regional route. The Fairchild had a service ceiling of about 29,000 feet. The highest peaks of the Andes reach nearly 23,000. In good weather, in clear skies with an experienced pilot, the margins were manageable. They were about to fly without any of those conditions. Among the passengers was Fernando Nando Parrado, 22 years old, a business student and the son of a successful hardware store owner in Montevideo. He was traveling with his mother, Eugenia, and his 19-year-old sister, Susanna. A family trip inside a rugby trip. Nando was not the team captain. He was not the leader. He was not even the toughest player on the squad. He was a quiet, good-looking boy from a comfortable family who loved his mother and worshipped his little sister. He had no wilderness training, no mountaineering experience, no survival skills of any kind. He was, by every measurable standard, the least prepared person on that plane for what was about to happen. And yet, 72 days later, he would walk out of the Andes on broken feet, having crossed the highest mountain range in the Western Hemisphere with no map, no compass, and no climbing gear. Why him? That answer takes the entire story to understand. Beside him sat Roberto Canessa, 20 years old, a second-year medical student with the stubborn temperament of a man twice his age. Roberto was argumentative, blunt, and brilliant. He questioned everything. He challenged everyone. And in a few days' time, he would become the group's only doctor performing surgery with broken glass in a metal tube buried in snow. Marcelo Perez was the team captain, the natural leader, the organizer, the boy who had arranged this trip, sold the tickets, filled the seats. He was the one every boy looked to when things went wrong. Carlitos Pease, at 19, was the youngest, the storyteller, the comedian, the boy with the infectious grin who would keep people laughing when there was nothing left in the world to laugh about. And Fito Strauch, quiet, methodical, mechanical, would become the group's engineer, turning Wreckage into survival equipment with nothing but ingenuity and desperation. None of them knew yet what roles the mountain would assign them. On October 12th, they were just friends going to a rugby match. On October 12th, the plane left Montevideo and flew west toward the Andes. But the weather over the mountains was terrible, heavy cloud cover, turbulence, zero visibility. The pilot, Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, a veteran with nearly 6,000 flight hours, made the right call. He diverted south to Mendoza, Argentina, and landed safely. They would wait for the weather to clear and try again the next day. That night, the boys went out in Mendoza. They drank wine in sidewalk cafes. They explored the city. They were young, and the delay was just another adventure, an unexpected night out in a foreign town. But the delay created pressure. Argentine regulations required that any diverted military aircraft either depart within 24 hours or go through a lengthy bureaucratic clearance process. The boys were anxious. They had a rugby match to play on Saturday, hotel reservations waiting in Santiago, friends expecting them at the airport. So on the morning of October 13th, a Friday, when the weather was still marginal, better than the day before, but far from ideal, with clouds still clinging to the passes, the question was not whether the conditions were safe. The question was whether the boys would accept another delay. They wouldn't, and the pilots who should have said no said yes. Here's why that mattered. What happened next was not one mistake. It was 5, stacked on top of each other like dominoes, each one invisible to the men making it, each one lethal only in combination. Error 1. The pilot allowed the co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Laguerrara, to fly the Andes crossing as a training exercise. Laguerrara was competent but had far less experience with this route. Ferradas had completed 29 prior crossings. He was confident. Confidence in the Andes is a form of debt. Error 2. The weather had improved slightly, but the cloud layer over the mountains remained thick and unbroken. They would be flying entirely on instruments, no visual confirmation of the peaks below, no landmarks, no horizon. Blind. Error 3. Because the Fairchild couldn't fly high enough to clear the tallest peaks directly, the standard route required flying south along the Argentine side of the Andes, turning west through a low pass near Planchon, then descending northward into the Chilean Central Valley. This entire route relied on dead reckoning, calculating position from speed, time, heading, and estimated wind correction. In clouds, with unpredictable mountain winds shoving the plane off course, dead reckoning is only as good as the pilot's ability to account for what he cannot see. And Laguerrara could not see anything. Error 4. At 3:21 p.m., Laguerrara radioed air traffic control in Santiago and reported that they had passed the Chilean town of Curicó, the standard waypoint confirming safe passage through the mountains. Based on this report, he began his descent toward Santiago. But they had not passed Curicó. They were still deep inside the Andes. The mountain winds had been blowing against the plane for nearly an hour, slowing its ground speed without any visible indication in the cockpit. Laguerrara's dead reckoning told him they were over the Chilean lowlands. In reality, they were surrounded by peaks on every side. He was descending into a wall of rock he could not see. Error 5. By the time the clouds tore open and the pilots saw granite and snow filling the windscreen close enough to see individual boulders, it was too late. Ferradas seized the controls. He pulled back with everything he had. Engines at full power screaming, the airframe shaking apart. The plane climbed, but the mountain was already there. At 3:34 p.m., the right wing clipped a ridge. It sheared off, a sound like a cannon shot. The left wing followed, ripping away and cartwheeling into the white. The tail section tore free, taking 2 rows of passengers with it into the sky, seats and all, their screams swallowed instantly by wind and altitude. The fuselage, now an open-ended metal tube traveling at nearly 200 miles per hour, slammed into a steep glacier slope at approximately 12,000 feet and began to slide. It slid for hundreds of meters down the mountainside, snow spraying upward in a rooster tail, decelerating as the glacier absorbed its momentum, seat rows crushing forward into each other like an accordion, until it finally came to rest, broken, steaming, half buried in a shallow depression that would later be named the Valley of Tears. Inside, chaos, wreckage screaming. 12 people were already dead, crushed, thrown from the aircraft, killed on impact. Several more were dying where they lay, tangled in metal and luggage and each other. The rest, battered, bleeding, disoriented, were scattered inside a shattered metal cylinder at an altitude where the air holds 40% less oxygen than at sea level, where nighttime temperatures fall to minus 30 degrees Celsius, and where the nearest human being was somewhere on the other side of the tallest mountain range in the Americas. It was Friday the 13th, and the sun was going down. The crash killed 12, 33 survivors with injuries ranging from broken legs to fractured skulls, 0 medical supplies, 0 shelter beyond a fuselage with no back wall, open to the mountain like a mouth, nightfall in 90 minutes, temperature dropping toward 30 below. Most stories would end here. This one is just beginning. That first night was chaos. Roberto Canessa, the second-year medical student who had never treated anything worse than a textbook exam, became the only doctor for 33 broken people. He worked in the dark, by feel, on his hands and knees inside the wreckage. He set broken bones using strips of aluminum torn from the fuselage skin. He cleaned open wounds with handfuls of snow. He pushed a steel rod back through the abdomen of a woman it had impaled and prayed, actually prayed, out loud, that the internal bleeding would stop on its own, because he had nothing else. Around him, the temperature was plummeting. The wind screamed through the open tail of the fuselage. The survivors huddled together, the living pressed against the dying, body heat the only resource they had in abundance. Nando Parrado was unconscious. The crash had slammed him forward into the seat ahead, fracturing his skull. Blood matted his hair. His breathing was shallow. No one expected him to survive the night. He would remain in a coma for 3 days. When he finally opened his eyes, confused, disoriented, reaching for his mother, the first thing he was told was that Eugenia was dead. She had died on impact. She was already buried in the snow outside. His sister Susanna was alive, but barely. Her injuries were devastating. Her kidneys were failing. Her body was shutting down system by system in the thin, frozen air. Susanna died 8 days later, in Nando's arms. And in that moment, holding his sister's body in a metal tube on a glacier in the middle of nowhere, something happened to Nando Parrado that no psychology textbook can fully explain. His grief did not paralyze him. It ignited him. He had one family member left. His father, sailor waiting at home in Montevideo, not knowing if any of his family was alive, not knowing if he had anyone left. That became Nando's engine. Not hope, not faith, not the will to live in the abstract. Something more primal, more specific, more unbreakable than any of those. A son's refusal to let his father believe all three of them were dead. In those first days, the survivors organized under Marcelo Perez, their rugby captain. On the pitch, Marcelo had been the steady hand, the one who rallied the boys when they were losing, who kept his head when tempers flared. Now, at 12,000 feet, surrounded by death, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He imposed order. He rationed the only food they had: a few chocolate bars, some crackers, a handful of dried fruit, some bottles of wine and liquor from the luggage, dividing each item into portions the size of a fingernail. One per person per day. He assigned sleeping positions inside the fuselage, bodies packed together like sardines for warmth, the injured placed in the center where the heat collected. He established roles: who would clear snow, who would care for the wounded, who would watch the sky. They did everything right by the logic of civilization. Stay calm, ration food, signal for help, wait for rescue. They were certain rescue was coming. How could it not be? A plane carrying 45 people had disappeared. Governments would be searching. Radar would have tracked them. Surely someone knew approximately where they were. They had seen planes overhead, tiny silver points scratching contrails across the impossible blue. They had heard engines. One boy swore on his life that a plane had dipped its wings, the universal signal for "we see you." But the fuselage was white. The snow was white. From the air at any altitude, the wreckage was invisible. No one had seen them. 5 more people died from their injuries in that first week. Infections that Roberto couldn't treat. Internal bleeding he couldn't stop. Cold that crept into broken bodies and finished what the crash had started. The group shrank to 28, and the food rations calculated for a 3-hour flight's worth of snacks was being stretched across days that turned into a week. By day 9, there was almost nothing left. A square of chocolate the size of a postage stamp, a capful of wine. The human body at altitude in freezing temperatures burns 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day just staying alive. They were consuming fewer than 100. They were starving to death, slowly, quietly, in broad daylight with clear blue skies overhead. Roy Harley, the team's amateur engineer, a boy who liked to tinker with electronics, had salvaged a small transistor radio from the wreckage. With wire from the fuselage and patience that bordered on obsession, he rigged an antenna. Every evening the survivors clustered around that radio, 28 faces in the dark, straining to hear through waves of static, waiting for a single word. Their names, their flight number, anything. On day 10, the radio finally delivered news. It was the worst news any of them could have imagined, and it changed everything. On the evening of October 22nd, day 10, Roy Harley tuned the transistor radio and found a Chilean broadcast. The announcer's voice was casual, matter of fact, reading a news bulletin between items about weather and sports. The kind of voice that doesn't know it's destroying someone's world. The search for Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 had been officially called off. After 8 days, the Chilean, Argentine, and Uruguayan authorities had concluded that no one could have survived the crash. The wreckage had not been located. The aircraft was presumed destroyed in the high Andes. The search was over. The passengers were declared dead. The announcer moved on to the next story. Silence filled the fuselage. No one spoke, no one moved. 28 people sat in a frozen metal tube at 12,000 feet, surrounded by the bodies of their friends, and listened to the world announce, in a voice that did not care, that could not care, that was already talking about something else, that they were dead. And they understood for the first time, with a clarity that felt like falling, that no one was coming. No one. Never. If they were going to survive, they would have to save themselves. But to save themselves, they needed strength. To get strength, they needed food. And the only food on that mountain was the frozen bodies of their friends. What happened next is the part of this story that the world could not forgive, and the part the survivors could never fully explain to anyone who wasn't there. Most documentaries skip what this decision actually felt like. The silence before anyone spoke. The way grown men looked at the snow, and then at each other, and then at the snow again. We won't skip it. The discussion did not happen all at once. It did not begin with a speech or a vote or a declaration. It began in whispers. 2 boys huddled at the far end of the fuselage, speaking so quietly that the words barely carried past their own breath. Then 3, then 5. Small groups scattered across the wreckage, each one circling the same unspeakable idea, testing it against each other's eyes before anyone dared say it aloud. Roberto Canessa, the medical student, was among the first to speak openly. He approached it the only way he could, clinically, almost defensively, as if he were presenting a case study in a lecture hall instead of standing on a glacier surrounded by corpses. The human body needs protein. Without it, the muscles consume themselves, the organs follow. At 12,000 feet in the dead of an Andean winter, the metabolic demand is enormous. They had no animals, no plants, no insects, no lichen on the rocks, no roots beneath the snow. At this altitude in this season, nothing lived. The snow around them was biologically sterile. Their bodies were already eating themselves, cannibalizing their own muscle tissue to keep their hearts beating for another day, another hour. Without protein, he told them, they would all be dead within a week, maybe 2. The math was not debatable. The math was not interested in their feelings about it. But not everyone could hear it as math. Marcelo Perez, the captain, the Catholic, the responsible one, the boy who had organized this trip and sold the extra seats and convinced everyone it would be an adventure, stood in the wreckage and said what no one else had the courage to say plainly. I organized this flight, he said. His voice was quiet, shaking. And now we're going to eat our friends. It was not a question. It was not permission. It was a man confronting the full weight of what his decisions had set in motion and finding that weight unbearable. Others argued theology. Some of these boys had attended Catholic school together since childhood. They had memorized catechism. They had taken communion. They understood the body and blood of Christ as sacrament, as symbol, as something given willingly for the salvation of others. Was this different? Was this the same? If God had placed them here, if God had placed the bodies here, preserved by cold, surrounded by nothing else, was refusing to eat not itself a sin? Was choosing to die when survival was possible, not a rejection of the very life God had given? They debated, they wept, they stared at the snow. And then Nando Parrado cut through the theology with the bluntness that would define every decision he made for the next 62 days. He turned to Carlitos Pease, the youngest, the one who still had hope written on his face like a child's drawing, and said 6 words. Carlitos, yo me como al piloto. Carlitos, I'm going to eat the pilot. It was not a philosophical statement. It was not a prayer or a debate or a compromise. It was a decision. A small group went outside. The sun was bright. The sky was the deep, merciless blue that only exists at altitude, the color of a world with too little air between you and space. The mountains surrounded them in every direction, white and silent and patient, the way mountains have always been patient. They chose a body, one of the passengers who had died in the crash, half buried in the snow, preserved by the freezing temperatures in the same way a butcher's freezer preserves what hangs inside it. The comparison was unavoidable. The revulsion was total. Using a piece of broken glass, because they had no knife, no blade, nothing designed for cutting, they sliced thin strips of frozen flesh from the body. The glass shook in someone's hand. They laid the strips on a piece of aluminum from the fuselage skin to dry in the thin Andean sunlight. Then they went back inside. The group gathered. No one looked at anyone else. Some ate immediately, forcing the strips into their mouths with the mechanical determination of people who had decided that thinking would be worse than chewing. Some waited hours. Some waited days. Some wept as they swallowed, tears freezing on their cheeks. Some refused entirely at first, surviving on snow and willpower, and only gave in when their bodies collapsed and their vision went dark and the choice became eat or die, not as metaphor, but as medical fact. Roberto Canessa later described the moment with the detachment of a man who had spent 50 years trying to make peace with what his hands had done. The first bite, he said, is like the first sexual relation. Lots of expectations, and then it's over, and you realize it was just meat. Just meat. The words sound clinical. They were meant to, because the alternative to describe what it actually felt like, the taste and the texture and the knowledge of whose body it was, and what his name had been, and what his mother's face looked like, was something Roberto Canessa would spend the rest of his life not fully saying. They made a pact. Each person agreed out loud in front of the others that if they died, the rest should use their body. It was not spoken with bravery. It was spoken with the flat resignation of people who have run out of alternatives. And within that resignation was something else. Something the tabloids would never see, something the condemnation would never reach. A gift. The dead would feed the living. The living would carry the dead home in the only way that mattered, by surviving. This was not the end of their humanity. This was the decision that saved it. 1 week later, on October 29th, day 17, the mountain reminded them that survival is not a decision you make once. It had been snowing for 2 days. Heavy, wet snow that piled on the slopes above the fuselage in layers that the survivors had learned to watch with unease. Some of the boys had begun sleeping with their shoes on, a reflex they couldn't explain, the instinct that something was coming. At midnight it came. An avalanche roared down the slope above the crash site and buried the fuselage. Snow poured through the open rear of the plane in a solid wave, not like water, but like wet concrete, filling the interior in seconds, pressing bodies against the fuselage walls, sealing the exits, burying everything in suffocating white darkness. 28 people were entombed alive. Those who could move clawed upward through the snow, gasping, choking, digging with bare hands toward air they could not see. Roy Harley, the engineer, the radio boy, punched through the surface and began pulling others out, one by their arms, their hair, anything he could grab. Those near the top of the sleeping pile survived. Those at the bottom, pinned under the weight of snow and bodies and wreckage, did not. 8 people died that night. Among them was Marcelo Perez, the captain, the organizer, the reluctant leader who had carried the group's conscience on his shoulders since the first morning, who had rationed the food, assigned the roles, held the boys together with nothing but authority and guilt and the desperate hope that someone would come. Marcelo's death was more than a loss of a man. It was the collapse of the group's first order. The structure that had governed them since the crash. The captain gives the orders, the team follows, rescue is coming, was gone. Buried in snow, along with everything it had represented. The boys who had been waiting to be told what to do suddenly had no one to tell them. 19 people remained. For 3 days after the avalanche, they were sealed inside the fuselage by packed snow, unable to open the exits, unable to stand, unable to do anything but lie on top of each other in the dark and breathe the same thin, recycled air over and over. They survived by poking a metal rod through the snow above them to create a breathing hole, a straw through which the outside world sent them just enough oxygen to keep their hearts beating. On the 3rd day, the snow settled enough to dig out.
We're on the mountain.
When they finally emerged, blinking, skeletal, disoriented, the Andes were exactly as they had been. White, silent, empty. Completely indifferent to whether 19 human beings lived or died beneath them. If you followed this far, you understand something most accounts of this story miss. These boys were not saved by luck. They were not saved by faith alone. They were not saved by some innate superhuman quality that separated them from the rest of us. They were saved by a series of choices, each one harder than the last, each one demanding that they abandon another piece of the world they had known. They had already crossed the line that civilization considers unforgivable. Now they would discover whether crossing it had been enough, or whether the mountain demanded more. After the avalanche, something shifted inside the fuselage. It was not visible, it was not spoken, but everyone felt it. The era of waiting was over. Leadership did not pass to a single person. It distributed itself, quietly, organically, among the survivors who had something to offer. And in this new order, each person's value was measured not by who they had been in Montevideo, but by what they could do on a glacier with nothing. Fito Strauch, the quiet one, the mechanical one, the boy who saw every problem as a puzzle with a solution hiding somewhere inside it, began to build. With no tools, no materials, no training, and no precedent, Fito turned the wreckage of a Fairchild FH-227D into a survival laboratory. He fashioned a solar water collector from a sheet of aluminum torn from the fuselage and a piece of clear plastic salvaged from a seat cover. Laid at the correct angle to the sun, it melted snow into a thin stream of drinkable water, the first reliable hydration system they had possessed since the crash. He made crude snowshoes by lashing seat cushions to his feet with wire, allowing expeditions to walk on the surface, instead of sinking to their waists with every step. He improvised sunglasses by cutting strips from the cockpit's tinted sun visor and wiring them to his face, because the ultraviolet radiation at 12,000 feet was blistering exposed skin and blinding anyone who spent more than an hour outside without protection. He figured out how to layer seat fabric and insulation material into the sleeping area, reducing heat loss through the fuselage floor that had been stealing body warmth all night, every night since the crash. Each invention was small. None of them was dramatic. Each one extended their survival by days. Roberto Canessa continued to tend the injured and the sick, and by now everyone was both. He amputated gangrenous tissue with a razor blade. He drained infected wounds with a hollow metal tube. He set fractures by feel, aligning bone fragments through swollen skin, with nothing for the pain except the cold itself, which at least numbed the screaming for a few seconds. He told boys who were dying that they would be fine, because the alternative, telling the truth, would have killed morale faster than starvation ever could. And Carlitos Pease, the youngest, the storyteller, the boy with the grin that no one could explain or resist, did something that no survival manual in any language accounts for. He made people laugh. In the darkest hours, in the freezing nights when men lay packed together like animals in a pen, shivering and weeping and wondering if the morning was worth reaching, Carlitos told jokes. He recounted rugby matches, every tackle, every try, every ridiculous penalty. He imitated their professors back at university, doing the voices, the gestures, the pompous little lectures about constitutional law and dental anatomy that had seemed so boring 6 weeks ago and now seemed like dispatches from another planet.
I can't find them.
He kept alive the one thing that freezing, starving, grief-shattered men need more than calories, the belief that they were still human beings, that they still had names, that somewhere beyond the white, the world they had known still existed.
All right, this should work.
Humor was Carlitos Pease's invention, and it saved as many lives as Fito's water collector. From the beginning, the strongest survivors had understood that waiting was death dressed up as patience. Someone would have to walk out. Someone would have to cross the mountains on foot and reach civilization and bring help back before the last body was consumed and the last heart stopped. But walk where? The co-pilot, before he died, had told them they had passed Curicó, a Chilean town in the Central Valley on the western side of the Andes. If that was true, then Chile lay to the west, just over the nearest ridge. A short walk, maybe 2 or 3 days. But looking west from the crash site, the boys saw nothing but a wall of snow-covered peaks rising into the sky like the teeth of some enormous jaw. No passes, no valleys, no gaps, just rock and ice and altitude, stretching higher than any of them had ever been in their lives. No one among them had ever climbed anything more technical than a staircase. Several early expeditions were attempted. They all failed. A group hiked east downhill into the wider valley and discovered the tail section of the plane lying in the snow several miles from the fuselage. A crucial find. It contained suitcases, batteries, chocolate bars, and cigarettes. But it also revealed how vast and empty the terrain was in every direction. The mountains went on and on. There were no roads, no trails, no footprints, nothing. Another group attempted to climb the nearest ridge to the west, hopping to see over the top and into Chile. They made it partway up, sinking to their waists in soft snow, gasping in the thin air, their hearts pounding at 160 beats per minute from the altitude, before exhaustion and mountain sickness turned them back. They returned with one critical piece of intelligence. The valley they were in was completely enclosed. There was no easy way out in any direction. Every failed attempt consumed calories that could not be replaced. Every failed attempt consumed hope. And here is the cruelest irony of this entire story, a fact that none of the survivors would learn for decades. An abandoned resort hotel, the Hotel Termas del Cisnido, stood just 13 miles to the east. It had walls, a roof, shelter from the wind, possibly food in its storerooms. They never went far enough east to find it. They went west instead because a dying co-pilot told them Chile was close. The wrong direction, chosen for the right reasons. Trust in authority, even when authority was wrong. That single navigational lie, we already passed Curicó, didn't just misdirect the rescue teams. It misdirected the survivors themselves. By late November, 6 weeks after the crash, the group had stabilized into a grim but functional society. A society no anthropologist had ever studied, because no anthropologist had ever imagined one. The living ate the dead. This was no longer debated. It was no longer wept over. It was Tuesday. It was breakfast. The healthy cared for the sick. The sick accepted care with the quiet shame of people who knew they were consuming resources they could not repay. Roles were clear. Fito built, Roberto doctored, Carlitos comforted. Roy maintained the radio, still listening, still hopping, still turning the dial through static that sounded increasingly like the voice of God saying nothing. And Nando planned. While others focused on surviving another day, Nando Parrado focused on leaving. He studied the mountains obsessively, watching the sun track across the sky from east to west, estimating compass direction by the angle of the shadows. He stared at the western ridge, the enormous unnamed peak that blocked their path, and tried to calculate its height, its slope, its distance. He hoarded extra food, strips of dried flesh packed into socks, and rolled up rugby jerseys, building a cache of rations for a trek he could not yet describe, but refused to abandon. The group reached a decision. A final expedition would go west, over the mountains, toward Chile or toward whatever lay on the other side. The strongest would go, the rest would wait. If the expedition failed, everyone would die. This was understood. It was not discussed further. 3 men were chosen: Nando Parrado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Tintin Vicentin, a solid, reliable boy built like a forward who had the strength to carry weight and the temperament to follow without complaint. Fito Strauch sewed them a sleeping bag. He took insulation material from the tail of the fuselage, the quilted fabric that had lined the plane's skin, and stitched it together with copper wire and thread pulled from clothing. 1 bag for 3 men, because they didn't have enough material for 2. They packed their rations. They put on every layer of clothing they could find, pants over pants, shirts over shirts, socks stuffed with padding, shoes wrapped in fabric. They looked less like mountaineers than like scarecrows assembled by someone who had never seen a human being. They said goodbye. Not dramatically, not with speeches, with handshakes and embraces and the kind of eye contact that says everything words cannot. I know what you're about to do. I know you might not come back. I know this is the last time I might see you. Go anyway. On December 12th, day 61, Nando Parrado, Roberto Canessa, and Tintin Vicentin turned their backs on the fuselage and began walking west. Into the highest mountains on Earth, with no map, no compass, no climbing gear, no rope, no tent, no stove, no way to call for help, and no guarantee that anything lay on the other side except more mountains, more snow, and more silence. The mountain that blocked their path to the west had no name on any map. It would later be called Cerro Cellar, named after Nando's father, the man waiting in Montevideo, the man who had already buried his wife and daughter in his mind and was now burying his son. It rose at a 45-degree angle from the valley floor, covered in deep, unstable snow, into a sky so thin that every 10 steps forced them to stop, bend double, and gasp for air that didn't have enough oxygen in it to feed a candle. They climbed for 3 days. Nando led, always. He did not ask. He did not negotiate. He simply went first, planting his feet in waist-deep snow, pulling himself upward step by agonizing step, and the others followed because following was easier than deciding. Roberto came second, stubborn, furious, his medical mind calculating the altitude sickness symptoms as they appeared in his own body, the headaches, the nausea, the confusion, the way his thoughts kept fragmenting like a radio losing its signal. He knew what was happening to them physiologically. He climbed anyway. Tintin brought up the rear, silent, steady, carrying more than his share of the food because he was the strongest and because no one had to ask. They moved without speaking. There was nothing to say that the mountain had not already said. At night, they crawled into Fito's handmade sleeping bag, 3 grown men in a sack designed for warmth that it could not provide, and shivered until dawn. Their feet were blistered, cracked, and bloody inside their makeshift shoes. Their lips were split to the flesh. Their skin was burned black by ultraviolet radiation. They were consuming their own muscle tissue faster than the dried strips of flesh could replace it. On December 15th, day 64, Nando Parrado reached the summit. He stood at roughly 15,000 feet above sea level, alone for a moment before the others caught up, breathing in shallow, rapid pulls, his vision swimming, his heart slamming against his ribs. He looked west and saw mountains. Mountains beyond mountains beyond mountains, stretching to every horizon in every direction. An endless, white, frozen ocean of peaks, range after range after range, with no roads, no valleys, no green, no smoke, no rooftops, no sign of human life anywhere. He had expected to see Chile. He had expected green valleys, roads, houses, the red roofs of Santiago in the distance. He had expected the hard part to be over. Instead, he saw 50 more miles of the Andes. The view from that summit was a death sentence made visible.
Look at that.
Most men would have turned back.
Almost there.
Most men, standing on that ridge, looking at that infinity of white, would have sat down in the snow and calculated the mathematics of impossibility and concluded, rationally, correctly, sensibly, that it could not be done, that the distance was too great, that the food was too little, that the body cannot do what the mind demands when the mind has lost all contact with reality. Most men would have gone back to the fuselage and waited to die with their friends. Nando Parrado was not most men. He stood on that summit and looked at those mountains, range after range of them, a frozen infinity that would have crushed any sane person's will. And he made a calculation that no rational person would make. He saw far in the distance, impossibly far, beyond range after range of peaks, two mountains that had no snow on their summits, bare rock, dark against the white. And Nando Parrado, who was not a geologist, who was not a mountaineer, who was not a navigator, who was a 22-year-old business student from Montevideo, who had learned everything he knew about survival in the last 64 days, looked at those bare peaks and thought, if they have no snow, they are lower. If they are lower, the land beyond them drops. If the land drops, there might be a valley. In a valley, there might be a river. A river flows downhill. Downhill leads somewhere. Somewhere is enough. It was not logic. It was barely hope. It was a son telling himself that his father was alive in Montevideo, and that nothing, not 50 miles of frozen mountains, not dehydration, not exhaustion, not frostbite, not altitude sickness, not the absolute mathematical impossibility of crossing the Andes on foot with no equipment, was going to stop him from getting home. They made a brutal decision. Tintin would go back. He was the heaviest. He consumed the most food. His share of the remaining rations would be divided between Nando and Roberto, 2 men instead of 3, the same distance, slightly more food, slightly less impossible. Tintin accepted without argument. He embraced them both. Then he sat down on a makeshift sled of seat cushions, the same cushions Fito had used for snowshoes, and slid back down the mountain toward the fuselage, a descent that took minutes compared to the 3 days of climbing. He disappeared into the white below. Nando and Roberto turned west. 2 men, 10 days of rations, strips of human flesh packed in rugby socks, 50 miles of the highest mountain range in the Western Hemisphere. They began walking. For the next 5 days, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa walked through the Andes in conditions that should have killed them on the first morning and every morning after. They descended from the summit into a valley that looked from above like it might offer passage west. It didn't. It dead-ended against another ridge. They climbed again. Another valley, another dead end, another climb. The Andes are not a single wall. They are a maze, ridge after ridge, valley after valley, each one looking from the top like it might be the last, each one revealing another behind it. They crossed frozen rivers, balancing on rocks coated in ice. They stumbled through snowfields that looked solid and collapsed under their weight, plunging them waist deep, hip deep, sometimes chest deep, forcing them to claw their way out with arms that no longer had the strength to pull their own body weight. They walked from before sunrise until after dark, not because they chose to, because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant arithmetic. How many strips of flesh remained, how many days they could last, how many miles were left, and the arithmetic was a death sentence every time they ran it. They ate strips of human flesh that had dried in the sun to the texture and taste of old leather. They melted snow in their mouths because they had no way to make fire. The meltwater was never enough. Dehydration at altitude is relentless. The dry air pulls moisture from the lungs with every breath. Roberto's feet developed frostbite. The skin blackened. The pain was extraordinary, and then worse, it stopped, which meant the nerves were dying. He knew what frostbite meant. He knew what it would cost him. He was a medical student. He kept walking. Nando's vision blurred from snow blindness and altitude. The world softened at the edges, hazing into a white glare that made distance impossible to judge. He walked toward shapes that turned out to be nothing. He stumbled over rocks he could not see. They stopped talking. There was nothing to say. Each step was a negotiation, the body's demand to stop against the mind's refusal to obey. And the mind was winning, but only barely, and only because the mind had something the body did not: a father waiting in Montevideo. On approximately December 18th, day 67, the snow began to thin. Rocks appeared beneath their feet, then patches of brown earth, then moss, tiny, green, insignificant moss clinging to a boulder, and Nando Parrado stopped and stared at it as if it were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, because it was alive, and alive meant altitude was dropping, and dropping meant somewhere below them the world still existed. Then grass, rough brown alpine grass growing between the stones. Then green. The color green, which they had not seen in 67 days. On December 20th, day 69, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa stumbled out of a ravine and into a river valley. They saw cows, standing in a meadow chewing grass, enormous and mundane and unbelievable. Cows, animals with weight and warmth and the dumb patience of creatures that have never been lost. They saw trees, poplars lining a riverbank, their leaves moving in a breeze that smelled like earth and water and life. They saw across the river the Rio San Jose, swollen with snowmelt, roaring over rocks, a man on horseback. His name was Sergio Catalan. He was a Chilean arriero, a mountain herdsman, tending his cattle in the summer pastures near the settlement of Los Matines. He was an ordinary man doing ordinary work on an ordinary day. He saw two creatures on the far bank that barely looked human, emaciated beyond recognition, their cheekbones protruding, their eye sockets hollow, their skin burned black by 69 days of unfiltered Andean sun. Bearded, ragged, their clothes layers upon layers of torn fabric, hanging from their frames like flags from a pole, standing on swollen, blackened, bleeding feet. They were screaming across the river, but the water was too loud. The words were swallowed before they reached the other side. Sergio Catalan did not run. He did not panic. He was a man of the mountains, and the mountains had taught him patience. He took a pencil and a piece of paper. He tied them to a stone, and he threw the stone across the river. Nando Parrado caught it, and with cracked, frost-bitten, bleeding hands, hands that had buried his mother, held his dying sister, cut flesh from the bodies of his friends, and pulled himself over the highest mountains in the Americas. He wrote a note. Vengo de un avión que se cae en la montaña. Soy uruguayo. Levamos 10 días caminando. Tengo 14 amigos heridos en el avión. Necesitamos que nos rescaten rápido porque no nos queda comida. I come from a plane that crashed in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have 14 injured friends at the plane. We need to be rescued quickly because we have no food left. Nando tied the note to the stone and threw it back across the river. Sergio Catalan unfolded the paper. He read it. He looked up at the two figures on the far bank, two boys who had walked out of a grave that the entire world had sealed shut 60 days ago. He mounted his horse, and he rode for 10 hours through the night to the nearest police station. They had done it. Two boys from Montevideo, with no gear, no maps, no training, no right to be alive, had crossed the Andes on foot. But 14 people were still on that mountain, still inside the fuselage, still eating the dead, still waiting. And the weather in the Andes does not wait for anyone. On December 22nd, day 71, the sound arrived before the machines did. A low, rhythmic thumping, distant at first, barely distinguishable from the wind, the kind of sound that a mind starved of stimulation might invent, might fabricate from desperation and exhaustion and the memory of a world that once had engines in it. But it grew louder and louder. And then the survivors inside the fuselage heard it clearly, unmistakably, for the first time in 10 weeks. Not wind, not imagination, not the mountain settling or the snow shifting or the metal creaking in the cold. Rotors. Helicopter rotors. Chilean Air Force helicopters, 2 of them, painted dark green, their blades chopping the thin air into a sound that 14 people had given up ever hearing again, appeared above the ridgeline to the west and descended into the Valley of Tears. The survivors stumbled out of the fuselage. They had been inside so long that the sunlight staggered them. They shielded their eyes with hands that were skeletal, blackened, cracked hands that had learned to do unspeakable things, and were now reaching upward toward a sky that had finally remembered they existed. They waved. They screamed. They wept not quietly, not with dignity, but with the full-throated animal wailing of human beings who had been buried alive for 71 days and were watching their own graves crack open. Some fell to their knees in the snow. Some embraced each other so hard they collapsed together. Some simply stood motionless, mouths open, staring at the helicopters as if they were hallucinations that might dissolve if anyone blinked. The pilots landed. They stepped out. They saw what was waiting for them. 14 survivors, gaunt beyond recognition, their faces all bone and shadow, their bodies swallowed by layers of torn fabric, their eyes enormous in their skulls. Standing among them, scattered across the snow, visible in every direction, human remains, bones, skulls, the evidence of 71 days of decisions that no pilot, no soldier, no rescue worker had ever confronted before. The pilots said nothing. They began loading passengers. But the glacier was steep. The altitude was extreme, nearly 12,000 feet, where the air is so thin that helicopter rotors lose lift and engines strain for oxygen. The weather was already deteriorating. Clouds were building over the western ridge. The pilots made the calculation: fuel, weight, altitude, wind, and delivered the verdict. They could take 6 today. The remaining 8 would have to wait until tomorrow. 6 survivors climbed aboard. The helicopters lifted off. The rotor washed through snow into the faces of the 8 men who remained, standing in the same spot where they had stood for 71 days, watching rescue fly away from them over the ridge. For one more night, 8 men slept in the fuselage, surrounded by the dead, surrounded by the evidence, surrounded by the smell and the cold and the silence that had defined every night since October 13th. But this night was different from every night before it, because this time they knew someone was coming back. On December 23rd, Day 72, the helicopters returned at dawn. The last 8 survivors were evacuated. The fuselage was left behind, open, empty, stained in the Valley of Tears, a cross of iron and a silence that would never fully lift. 72 days after the crash, 16 people came down from the Andes alive. At first, the world celebrated. 16 survivors, alive, after 72 days on a glacier, in an aircraft that every government on the continent had declared destroyed, carrying passengers that every authority had declared dead. It was a miracle. The word was used in every headline, in every language, on every continent. The miracle of the Andes. The story dominated front pages from Buenos Aires to London to Tokyo. Television crews descended on Santiago. Reporters fought for interviews. The world wanted to know how. How had they survived? How had they endured? How had 16 young men beaten 72 days at 12,000 feet with nothing? No supplies, no shelter, no training, no contact with civilization. Then the questions changed. What had they eaten? The fuselage was at 12,000 feet. No animals, no plants, no supply drops, no fishing, no hunting, no foraging. 72 days. The math was inescapable. The question hung in the air like smoke, and no celebration could blow it away. On December 28th, 5 days after the rescue, the survivors held a press conference in Montevideo. They sat together, thin, sunburned, still healing, behind a long table crowded with microphones. The room was packed. Cameras flashed. The silence before anyone spoke was absolute. And they told the truth. They confirmed that they had eaten the flesh of the dead. They described it plainly, without euphemism, without apology, and without shame. They explained the decision. They explained the pact. They explained that every person who had died had given consent, had said, in front of others, before God and before each other, "If I die, use my body." The world's reaction split in two. One half recoiled. "Cannibals of the Andes," the tabloids screamed. Letters of condemnation poured in from strangers who had never been hungry, never been cold, never been told by a radio announcer that they were already dead. Religious commentators debated sin and sacrilege in television studios with leather chairs and coffee. Moralists who had never missed a meal in their lives pronounced judgment from the warmth of their living rooms. The other half listened. And among those who listened most carefully were the people whose opinion mattered most, the families of the dead. The parents and siblings and wives of the 29 who did not come home. Many of them said something the world did not expect. They said they understood. They said their sons and daughters and husbands would have wanted it. They said the dead had given a gift, the most profound gift a human body can give, and that refusing it would have been the true sin. They said the boys who came home were carrying their children inside them, not as metaphor, but as fact. The protein that rebuilt their muscles, the energy that powered their legs over the mountains, the life force that kept their hearts beating long enough to reach Sergio Catalan, that was their children. Their children had brought these boys home. The Catholic Church, the institution that had shaped every one of these boys since baptism, officially stated that the survivors had committed no sin. And slowly, over months and years and decades, the story shifted. The cannibalism faded from the center of the narrative, not because it was forgotten, not because it was forgiven, but because it was finally understood. What replaced it at the center was something harder to sensationalize, and far more important. The 16 survivors went home to Montevideo. They returned to their families, their universities, their interrupted lives. They resumed the ordinary business of being young men in a small South American city, studying, working, falling in love, growing older. But they were not the same. And they did not pretend to be. Roberto Canessa became a pediatric cardiologist, one of the most respected in South America. He spent his career saving the hearts of children born with defects that no one else would attempt to repair. He operated on infants the size of his hand. He traveled to remote hospitals with no equipment and performed surgeries with whatever he could find. A man who had learned at 20 years old on a glacier with a razor blade and no anesthetic that medicine is nothing more than the refusal to let someone die, and that sometimes refusing is enough. Nando Parrado became a television producer, a businessman, a race car driver. He never stopped moving. Speed became his meditation, the only state in which his mind was quiet enough to exist without the mountains intruding. He married. He had daughters. He once said that he crosses the Andes every day of his life, not the physical mountains, but the distance between the person he was before October 13th and the person he became after. He said that distance never gets shorter. You just get better at walking it. Carlitos Pease, the youngest, the comedian, the boy who kept them laughing in the dark, became a motivational speaker who travels the world telling audiences to look back at their own mountain ranges. Mayern hasha atrás sus propias cordilleras, he says. Busquen lo positivo dentro de lo negativo. Look for the positive inside the negative. He delivers this with the same grin he wore at 12,000 feet, the one that no one could explain, the one that no amount of suffering could extinguish. Fito Strauch returned to quiet life. He did not seek the spotlight. He did not write books or give speeches. He lived as he had survived, practically, modestly, with the understated competence of a man who once built a water purifier from airplane wreckage and saw no reason to discuss it further. Roy Harley, the radio boy, the one who heard the world declare them dead and kept listening anyway, suffered from post-traumatic stress for years. The sound of static, the sound of helicopters, the sound of silence. These followed him home from the mountain and took decades to quiet. The 16 survivors held annual reunions for more than 50 years, gathering on December 22nd, the day they were rescued in Montevideo. They ate together. They drank wine. They remembered the dead by name, every face, every story. They brought their children and then their grandchildren and introduced them to the men who had made their existence possible. They did the one thing that had saved them on the mountain. They stayed together. There is an iron cross now in the Valley of Tears. It stands at the site where the fuselage came to rest, planted in the snow, anchored against the wind, surrounded by rock and ice at 11,700 feet. Families visit it. Survivors return. Pilgrims trek to it from both sides of the Andes, following the same paths that Nando and Roberto walked, but in reverse, carrying supplies and GPS units and warm clothing and the luxury of knowing where they are. The mountain has not changed. The glacier still moves inches per year, grinding stone into powder with the patience of something that has been doing this for 10 million years. The wind still howls through the valley at speeds that make standing upright an act of defiance. The snow still falls and melts and falls again. The air is still thin. The cold is still absolute. The Andes remain what they have always been: silent, indifferent, unmoved by human suffering or human courage or human love. The mountains do not know the names of the 29 who died there. The mountains do not know that 16 walked away. The mountains do not care. But something happened there that the mountains cannot erase. 45 ordinary people, boys from Montevideo, their mothers, their wives, their friends, were thrown into the most extreme test of survival in modern history. They were not trained for it. They were not equipped for it. They were not mentally prepared for it. They had no advantage except each other. And 16 of them lived. not because they were the strongest, not because they were the bravest, not because they were the most ruthless, not because they abandoned their humanity, because they held on to it. In the most inhuman circumstances imaginable, starving, freezing, surrounded by death, abandoned by the world, forced to do the one thing that every civilization on earth forbids, they loved each other. They cared for each other. They invented, adapted, suffered, mourned, laughed, prayed, argued, wept, and refused, absolutely refused, to let the mountain decide who they were. The world remembers this story as the story of cannibalism. The survivors remember it as the story of friendship. They are right, and the world is wrong. The 29 who died on that mountain gave their bodies so that 16 could live. It was not asked of them lightly. It was not taken from them carelessly. It was a gift given in words before witnesses with the full understanding of what it meant. And those 16 went on to have children, and those children had children. And today, more than 120 people walk the streets of Montevideo, go to school, fall in love, raise families, grow old. 120 people who exist because of what happened in the Valley of Tears. 120 heartbeats that began in the silence of a glacier. The dead fed the living. The living carried the dead home. That is not horror. That is love. And it is the deepest truth of the Andes. Thank you for staying until the end. This is not an easy story to sit with. I know that. The fact that you're still here tells me something about you. I have a question and I want an honest answer, not the answer you think you should give, the real one. If you were starving in the Andes, no rescue coming, no food, no options, surrounded by the frozen bodies of your friends who had already told you, out loud in front of everyone, to use their bodies if they died. Would you eat? Or would you accept death? There is no right answer. There is no wrong answer. There is only the truth of what you believe about yourself, and the humility to admit that you might not know until you're there. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. If this story stayed with you, if it's still sitting in your chest right now, the way it sits in mine, then next week I'm covering a story that belongs right beside it. Ernest Shackleton's Endurance Expedition, 1914. 28 men stranded on the ice of Antarctica for nearly 2 years after their ship was crushed. Here's the difference. No cannibalism, no deaths. Every single man survived, all 28. And the reason they survived is not luck, and it is not accident. It is one of the greatest leadership stories ever told. A man who sailed 800 miles across the stormiest ocean on Earth in a 22-foot lifeboat, with 5 men, in the dead of winter, to save a crew he refused to abandon. If the Andes shows you what ordinary people become when civilization disappears, Shackleton shows you what one extraordinary leader can do to keep it from disappearing at all. Subscribe so you don't miss it. If you're new here, this channel covers the true stories of survival, disaster, and human resilience that history tried to forget. Emotional, evidence-driven, and built on the real words of the people who were there. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.